it's true. Before I started speaking about these matters, I was indeed a potter. Ceramicist sounds a little bit too grand for the activity, but yes, I used to make pots, mainly bowls, and I spent a ridiculous amount of time inscribing poems all over the surfaces of bowls, and my idea was to make the bowl larger and larger and finer, pushing the material to its limits, and then I would cover it, writing for days with a poem. And I had this idea about 18 months before I finally stopped making pots, long before I even thought that I would stop making pots. And the idea was this. One day I would like the bowl to become so fine and so open that the bowl itself vanishes and the bowl is just made out of the words that I write on it. And then I forgot that idea. And strangely, a couple of years later and now, that's exactly what I find myself doing. So, last week on a retreat on the East Coast, somebody asked me if I felt that the two disciplines of science and non-duality were converging. And I said that I thought I would probably be in a better position to answer that question at the end of this weekend. But I must confess that I do sometimes wonder what happened to the ideas that were prevalent at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Ideas of people like Einstein and Schrödinger and Eddington and Pauli and James Jeans and Niels Bohr, all of whom understood that mind is inextricably interwoven into the way into our perception of the world, into the world itself. And as such, they placed consciousness at the very heart of reality. What took place that caused these ideas to become eclipsed by our contemporary mainstream materialist science? There may be many answers to that question, but one of them I would suggest is this, that in the mid-1970s, a definition of consciousness emerged. Thomas Nagel's definition, his erroneous definition of consciousness, which has since become the mainstream in academic circles and which was later substantiated in the ill-conceived hard problem of consciousness and now finds itself expressed in the idea of panpsychism. What was this definition of consciousness? Something like this, that an organism can be considered to be conscious or to have consciousness if there is something that it is like for that organism to be itself. Now, this seems at first sight to be a plausible definition of consciousness, but it is predicated on the erroneous idea that it is I, a human being, or I, a human body, that am conscious or have consciousness. And this is the original mistake upon which our entire world culture is founded. I, a human being or a human body, is not conscious, nor does it have consciousness. Only consciousness is conscious. Only awareness is aware. Only knowing knows. So we could rephrase this definition of consciousness in a way that is in line with the evidence of our experience, namely that consciousness is that which knows the experience of being itself. Or more simply, consciousness is that which knows the experience of being. It is not a human being that has experience or knows experience. A human being is experienced. It is consciousness alone that has or knows itself. And this consciousness is knowledge of itself, shines in each of our minds as the knowledge I or I am. As such, the name I is the name that which knows itself gives to itself, so it should be reserved for consciousness alone. Prior to the arising, before the knowledge I or I am is colored or qualified by experience, this pure I am, pure consciousness is without limitation and thus infinite. And in other words, it is infinite consciousness is knowledge of itself that shines in each of us as the simple knowledge I am. And being devoid of any limited qualities, this infinite consciousness that knows itself as I or I am is what is known in the religious traditions as God or God's infinite being. And this understanding is, in my opinion, nowhere better expressed than in the words of the Sufi mystic Balayani, who said this: no one sees him except himself. Please forgive my use of the male reflexive pronoun. It's just an old linguistic style that has no significance or implication, and I'm just an old-fashioned Englishman, so I like to use this language. So he says, no one sees him except himself. No one reaches him except himself. No one knows him except himself. He knows himself through himself, and he reaches himself by means of himself alone. Only he knows him. As such, I is the name that whatever it is that knows itself gives to itself. Human beings are not aware, dogs are not aware, bats are not aware, computers are not aware and never will be aware, stones and trees are not aware. All that is aware is consciousness. Once it is believed that consciousness is a property of a human being, it is only a matter of time before it is believed that dogs and bats and computers and stones have a modicum of consciousness, giving rise to the belief I mentioned earlier in panpsychism. But panpsychism is a cul-de-sac from which scientists and philosophers will sooner or later have to return. Unless and until scientists are willing to investigate the nature of their own minds, they will never know the nature of reality. And without knowing the nature of reality, science cannot ultimately contribute to a truly civilized and humane society. Bereft of such knowledge, the prevailing materialist paradigm, for all its undeniable benefits to society, contains within it the destruction of the society, the seeds of the destruction of the society whose role it is to serve. The growing despair felt by people, the conflicts that rage between communities and nations, and the destruction of our planet are all the inevitable consequences of the prevailing materialistic paradigm that informs almost every aspect of our culture. How is it possible for a scientist or indeed anyone to know the nature of reality? Everything that is known by the mind, through the mind. Therefore, the mind's knowledge of anything will always appear in accordance with its knowledge of itself, just as one who wears orange-tinted glasses will always see orange-colored snow. And just as the one who wears orange-tinted glasses forgets that he is doing so and imagines that the orange color is the property of the snow itself, likewise, each of our minds forgets that it is perceiving reality through the filter of its own limitations and imagines that the limitations of itself, our mind, is inherent in reality itself. How do we know that anything that is known or perceived by the mind is not simply a reification or an objectivization of the limitations of the mind through which it is known? In fact, we can be absolutely certain that it is. As such, there can be no higher endeavor nor any greater knowledge than to know the nature of the mind through which all knowledge and experience are known. How does the mind investigate its own essential nature? The essence of anything is that part of the thing that cannot be removed from it. If the mind removes from itself, or even imagines removing from itself, everything that is not essential to it, thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, perceptions, etc., what remains is its essence, that element of itself that can never be separated from it. And if each of us performs this experiment for ourselves, imagining removing the content of our experience from our minds, all that remains is pure knowing or pure consciousness. Being devoid of any of the limitations of experience, this consciousness is unlimited or infinite. If we want to build a model of reality, should we not start with the primary element of experience, eternal, infinite consciousness, the one element of our experience that we can be absolutely certain of, and only resort to or infer the existence of another material, namely matter, if we cannot account for everything that takes place in our experience using the consciousness-only model? And if science is not able to give us a sane model of reality upon which a truly civilized and humane society is based, then we should look to our poets and artists. They are the free thinkers for whom the unity of being has not yet been eclipsed by the apparent multiplicity and diversity of discrete objects and selves, each one separate and distinct from the other. As the German poet Liesl Müller said, "I will not return to a universe of objects that do not know each other, as if islands were not the lost children of one great continent." The great artists and poets are those whose minds are free enough and humble enough not to mistake the limitations of their own mind for reality, but who realize that what we see is but a symbol of reality. A symbol in this case is not something other than reality, or other than the reality that it presents. It is simply a partial view of that reality, which, depending on the point of view we take, either conceals that reality or reveals it. As William Blake said, the tree which moves some to tears of joy is, in the eyes of others, simply a green thing that stands in the way. Some see nature all ridicule and deformity. Some scarce see nature at all. But for the person of imagination, nature is imagination itself. So we might ask the question, what is the nature of the intelligence that has this as its appearance, this as its imagination. As the poet John Milton said in the religious language of his day, thine this universal frame, thyself how wondrous then. Consider the possibility that nature or reality is the imagination or activity of the one mind, pure knowing or consciousness, that assumes the form of each of our finite minds, through which it refracts itself into an apparent multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves. William Blake again, every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight enclosed by the five senses. Every bird, and by implication, every object, is an immense world of delight enclosed by sense perception, that is, appearing through the limited faculties of the senses as an object. In other words, pure delight or joy, that is, the knowing of being. Consciousness is knowledge of itself, refracts itself through the activities of thought and perception, and appears to itself as a multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves without ever becoming anything other than itself. Rilke expressed the same idea, but he took an apple rather than a bird to explore this. He said, dare to say what apple truly is, this sweetness, at first thick, dark, dense, then exquisitely lifted in your taste grows clarified, awake, luminous, double-meaninged, sunny, earthy, real. Oh, knowledge, pleasure, inexhaustible. The same idea, inexhaustible pleasure and knowledge, what William Blake called an immense world of delight, enclosed by sense perception and appearing as the objective world. In other words, our senses lie to us about the nature of reality, and yet contained within that lie is the truth. The role of the artist is to use the language of lies, sense perception, to speak of the truth. As Picasso said, art is a lie, but it makes us realize the truth. And he went on, the artist must know the means whereby to convince others of the truthfulness of his lies. And he might have added that the philosopher or scientist has a duty to humanity to see through the veiling power of common sense and to lay bare its reality, of which sense perception is but a limited or partial view. Remember Einstein, who said that common sense was just a series of prejudices that most people acquire by the age of 18. It is to this same understanding that the Sufi mystic Hafiz alluded to when he said, the world is all imagination, and yet it is real. Remember, an illusion is not something that is not real. An illusion that's something that is real, but is not what it appears to be. All these artists and writers are all representatives of the great tantric tradition in Western culture. They realized that the mind filters reality and renders it according to its own limitations. As such, mind is the activity of consciousness through which consciousness refracts itself into an apparent multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves. Thought refracts reality and makes it appear as time. Perception refracts reality and makes it appear as space. As such, time and space are simply how eternal infinite consciousness appears when filtered through the limitations of a human mind. They are the illusion whose reality is consciousness. A different kind of mind would perceive reality as a different kind of universe, depending on its limitations. But it would still be perceiving the same reality. The only reality there is infinite consciousness, or in religious language, God's infinite self-aware being. Let me suggest a model that makes this easier to understand. Take the analogy of a dream. When we have a dream at night, we dream a dreamed world within our own mind, but we cannot perceive the dreamed world directly. In order to perceive the dreamed world, we have to overlook the nature of our own mind and enter into our own dream as a separate subject of experience, from whose perspective the activity of our own mind appears as an outside world. Consider that each of us are dreams in the mind of God, or the mind of infinite consciousness. The only difference between our mind and infinite consciousness's mind is that our mind can only have one, localizes itself in its own dream as a single subject of experience, whereas infinite consciousness is presently localizing itself in its own imagination as each of our minds. We are all the separate subjects of experience, localizations of infinite consciousness, through whose agency consciousness knows itself as the outside world. In other words, consider the possibility that just as the dreamed world is what our imagination looks like when viewed from a separate subject of experience within the dream, consider that the world that we perceive is the imagination or activity of consciousness, which only appears as a multiplicity and diversity of objects themselves from our limited, localized perspectives. This is what Hafiz referred to when he suggested that the world is an exteriorization of an hidden inner reality. It's what David Bohm said, that reality and its appearance as the world are the implicate and explicate order of the same infinite, indivisible whole. It is not the world that veils reality. The world is shining with its reality, as its reality. It is belief that veils reality, or seems to. As Nisargadatta said, when somebody asked him if it was possible to see God, he said, yes, of course, just look around you. This collapse of infinite consciousness into the finite mind in order to manifest its infinite potential is what Ramana Maharshi referred to when he said, the I thought is the mother of the world. He didn't mean, of course, literally that the thought I creates the world. Animals and infants experience the world, but they don't have the thought I. What he meant was this localization of infinite consciousness in the form of the finite mind is the means by which infinite consciousness manifests its potential in form. Exactly the same understanding is expressed in the Tantric traditions, which says that the universe is an expansion of I. Prior to the limiting of itself as the finite mind, infinite consciousness has no dimensions. It is only when this dimensionless presence of consciousness, vibrating, so to speak, within itself, assumes limitations and seems to become a finite mind, that the world or the universe expands within itself. This understanding is nowhere better expressed in, having said that about Ramana Maharshi and the Tantric traditions, this understanding is nowhere better expressed, at least not in the West, than in Shakespeare's words in A Midsummer Night's Dream. He says this: as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, a poet's pen turns to shape them and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, a poet's pen turns to shape them and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Reality is not unknown or mysterious. It is the world. It is shining as the world. It is the world, as it is normally conceived, that is mysterious. So mysterious, in fact, that no one has ever found it or will ever find it. What we see as the world is the activity of God's mind, the activity of God's imagination, the activity of infinite consciousness, the activity of the essence of our own mind. It only appears as a universe in time and space from the perspective of a localized mind. Our mind has reified its own limitations and projected them onto reality. We do not think about the world because it exists. It seems to exist because we think of it. Divested of the limitations that the mind superimposes on reality, reality shines by itself, a single, infinite, indivisible, and utterly intimate whole, which ultimately cannot be named, for all names refer to things, and ultimately there are no things that have a name or can be named. As Balayani said, otherness for him is him without otherness. This absence of otherness is known in common parlance as love, the very essence and nature of reality itself, of which all of this is its appearance. Thank you.